There was a time when California was the American dream. With a staggering GDP approaching $4 trillion, it still remains the unrivaled champion of the American economy. If California were a nation unto itself, it would stand as the 5th largest economy in the world, surpassing the likes of the United Kingdom and India. Yet, what was once a dream for many has transformed into an all-American nightmare. California's story now bears the weight of a housing crisis that has plunged millions into poverty, harbouring half of America's unsheltered population. Its state government faces a deficit in the tens of billions, whilst its population has seen a decline of tens of thousands since the decade began. Which couldn't be in more contrast than Texas, a state ready to challenge California's throne as America's top state economy. The Lone Star State has attracted the likes of Elon Musk's Tesla away from California. Boasts an industrial base that already exports more than any other US state, with a rapidly growing population that has added more people this millennium than any other state, and even projected to surpass California within the next 30 years, to become America's largest state by population. This change in the balance is no accident, being as much about what Texas has done right as what California has done so catastrophically wrong. So, where to start? Let's rewind the clock to 1978, a pivotal year in California's history with the introduction of Proposition 13. This amendment to the state's constitution was a game-changer, aimed at the soaring property taxes that threatened homeowners. And at its heart lies a crucial clause, a cap that would forever alter California's fiscal landscape. Property taxes were to be capped at 1% of a property's assessed value, though the important part is the additional clause that guaranteed they couldn't rise by more than 2% in any given year. This 2% cap remains crucial. In a world where inflation and prices often outpace this modest increase, it meant one thing: taxes effectively grew slower than the economy itself, a seemingly paradoxical scenario where property taxes in real terms decreased as inflation eroded the value of money faster than the taxes could rise. And so with this began a new era in California's economic saga. For an average resident who bought their home in 1978, the advantage is clear. Acquiring a modest home for an average median price of $80,000 at the time, with a 2% increase would result in a property tax today of less than $2,000. Now compare that with today's staggering reality. A $750,000 home brings taxes of $7,500, which would skyrocket to over $18,000 over that same time period. This stark contrast has created a monumental incentive for Californians to cling tightly to their homes, stifling housing supply in the process. It's no wonder then that California's house prices have soared far above the national average, even when you account for higher wages. Shining a light on why California ranks lowest in home ownership nationwide, which is still an elusive dream for many. But this is just one piece of California's fractured economic puzzle. Another key piece is zoning laws, the rules which dictate where and what can be built. California has some of America's strictest zoning laws, where a vacant supermarket can remain unused in a residential neighborhood even if there is virtually no retail demand. And even where housing does manage to get built, another layer emerges: the shady hand of community groups with policies such as protecting neighborhood character, often resulting in communities forgoing meaningful housing supply for low-density housing, conveniently being beneficial for existing homeowners as these policies keep supply low, driving prices ever higher. California is a mountainous state. Its population, the largest in the US, is crammed in between the ocean on one side and the mountains and deserts on the other, placing huge pressure on its available land, making those low density and zoning policies seem even more ridiculous. Now, shift your gaze to Texas, a land blessed with expansive open plains ideal for supporting a burgeoning population, leading the nation when it comes to delivering new housing, with California trailing behind despite its larger population by 9 million. Its top 3 cities alone outpace their Californian counterparts by an astounding 300%, illustrating the more proactive approach Texas takes. A stark contrast indeed. This helps explain why tens of thousands of Californians have made the move to Texas, more than from any other state, compounded by Texas having the lowest outmigration rate of any state in America. But it's not just the dire housing situation that is pushing people away from California. How much money the state government allows its people to keep, or is perceived to allow them to keep, plays a crucial role. Here we start at the level of the individual. At the surface, there is no contest. California has a state income tax and Texas has none. Taking more income, the more you earn. A progressive tax policy. But here lies the problem to solve. If that's the case, then why does your average Texan end up paying a higher effective tax rate on their income than their Californian counterparts? Which is quite the accomplishment when you don't have a local income tax. So how is this possible? Just because Texas doesn't have an income tax doesn't mean it doesn't tax. After all, as Benji Franks once said, nothing is certain except for death and taxes, in particular property and sales taxes. Earlier I mentioned how Proposition 13 keeps Californian property taxes artificially low. Unfortunately for Texans, there is no equivalent subsidy on such a scale for local property taxes. Not only that, but to collect enough revenue, it charges a high sales tax. At the surface, this tax is on average higher than California's, but after accounting for the average incomes in both states, this is where taxes become proportionally more expensive in Texas. Note though, this comparison only holds true for your average worker. For the millionaires, well, they're laughing all the way to the bank. The amount of tax paid by the wealthy is a much smaller fraction of their incomes compared to both the average Texan or their millionaire equivalent in California. So, whilst moving to Houston may be a great idea for the richest, it just may not be as lucrative for your average worker, if we ignore all the cultural differences between the two states of course, but that's a different video entirely. Now, back to the money. This divergent tax approach is pivotal in explaining why Texas boasts a surplus, while California grapples with deficits projected well into the 2020s. And make no mistake, California's deficits are quite the headline. Running at a staggering $73 billion before cuts, that deficit is the equivalent of the GDP of Sri Lanka. Or 1.5 Sochi Winter Olympics, the most ludicrously expensive games ever held. This eye-watering sum begs a question: how the juggernaut of the US economy, California, ended up racking up such a debt? The answer for one of the most sophisticated economies in the world is complex, but two key factors are robots and the stock market. Let's start with the latter. When things are going well, progressive taxation literally pays off for the Californian government. Rich people love nothing more than to put their money to work, and where it often works hardest is in the stock market. Higher returns mean higher incomes mean higher income tax, which is all fine and dandy when things are on the up. But when things go south, stocks dip and losses emerge, and so does tax revenue. The problem for California is that over time, the state has become ever more dependent on income tax revenue, with this deficit coinciding with the underperformance of the stock market. And it's this dependency which helps explain the first factor as well: robots. At least indirectly. You see, Silicon Valley is famous for producing high-tech firms with armies of robots, including the ones bringing you this very video. The founders of these companies typically strive for one thing: to be the next unicorn startup, that being one exceeding $1 billion valuation. And once these go public through initial public offerings or IPOs, the investors cash in on the jackpot and produce a lot of tax revenue for the state. The trouble is that these unicorns are rare, and getting increasingly so. Reaching their peak in 2021 when 86 unicorns went public. In 2023, a mere 15 went public, helping to explain that decline in Californian tax revenue that I mentioned earlier. Texas, on the other hand, doesn't have that problem. In fact, it's doing rather well because of its opposite strategy. Its consumption-based taxes mean the high inflation of the early 20s has led to higher retail prices, and in consequence, higher sales taxes. Not forgetting that Texas' most famous industry, its oil industry, has driven lucrative revenues as oil prices have exploded. However, its industrial prowess goes far beyond oil. Its factories produce everything from cars to planes to semiconductors, making the state the largest exporter of the world's largest economy. Exporting an insane $444 billion, this dwarfs California's $178. Its dominance is so great that it almost exported as much to Mexico as California did to every other country. Surprisingly, the only country south of the border that California exported more to than Texas was French Guiana. The opportunities beyond its borders is a big reason why Texas has a bright future. Whilst both states share a southern border with Mexico, it's Texas that benefits disproportionately from geography. Beyond having the longest border with 4 Mexican states, it's much closer to Mexico's largest population centers. creating a steady stream of labor for the thousands of global companies which utilize Mexico as a gateway into the giant American market. A gateway more important than ever following trade wars and embargoes with America's economic rivals. The technical name for this business activity is nearshoring. The theory being that instead of producing goods abroad in places like China, Chinese companies can set up factories in Mexico and drive goods across to the US. But it's not even Chinese companies doing this. If we look at foreign direct investment into Mexico, which is often an indicator of nearshoring, China doesn't even account for 1% of FDI. Ironically, it's Americans themselves who are the biggest external funders of nearshoring by far. Shifting away from outsiders, Mexico itself is a rising economic titan on the brink of transformation. By the end of the decade, it's set to be one of the world's top 10 economies. And guess who stands to gain the most from this monumental shift? None other than Texas. The Lone Star State, renowned for its industrial prowess and strategic partnerships, is perfectly positioned to reap the rewards of Mexico's ascent. As trade corridors expand and investments surge, Texas in all likelihood will be the broker, middleman and financer of Mexico's economic boom. One which has not gone unnoticed by America's business community either. In the previous decade, more than 25,000 businesses and 250,000 jobs have flocked to Texas, with Texas projected to emerge not just as the country's largest economy, but a center to capitalize upon changing times both within and outside of America's borders. With its powerful industries, favorable tax policies, and proximity to emerging markets, Texas is set to define the next chapter in North American economic history. California, on the other hand, once the beacon of opportunity, faces formidable challenges amidst its economic complexities. From a housing crisis to government deficits, the Golden State is grappling with the consequences of its policies over decades. Ultimately, whether this is how events will unfold depends upon how both states harness their opportunities and face up to their challenges, something I hope to explore in future videos. If you enjoyed the video, you may also enjoy my twice-monthly newsletter Ripple Report, where I delve into the secondary impacts of main economic events. You can subscribe in the description below. Until our next encounter, stay curious.